Way Breakdown. Cutting through the spin. Exposing the truth. Liberty Ledger.
You surely have a figure for the economic growth needed to create the tax revenue to cover this. There's another extended pause as the camera zooms in on AOC's face. She was speechless. She hadn't crunched the numbers. She had never actually sat down to see if growth could even possibly foot the bill. I would have to check with some economists to give you those specific projections. Vance kept his tone soft, but his point was hitting hard. You have no idea, do you? You've been pushing Medicare for all for 6 years now. You've drafted the bills. You've made the speeches. You've told millions of people this is the fix for our healthcare system, yet you've never actually checked if it's financially feasible. AOC's face turned red. She started to sound defensive. I'm not here to play budget games in D.C. while people are dying from high insulin costs, lack of doctors, or medical bankruptcy. Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't get agitated, just stayed composed. This isn't a game, Congresswoman. It's simple math. You're asking Americans to let you overhaul a sixth of the entire economy, strip 180 million people of their insurance, and spend $3.4 trillion of their money every year. The very least you can do is show them how you're going to pay for it. He turned slightly to speak to the crowd. If someone asked you for $3.4 trillion a year but couldn't explain how they'd pay you back, would you give them the money? A few people in the audience shook their heads no. Even a couple of Democrats joined in. AOC tried to find a way back in. What about the moral obligation to treat healthcare as a human right? I'm not disputing the moral side of it. I'm questioning if your specific proposal actually works. And looking at this, I don't think you know if it does, because you never did the arithmetic. Silence. A very awkward silence. AOC had nothing to say because he hit the nail on the head. She hadn't done the math. She never felt like she had to. Up until this point, fiery rhetoric and moral pleas had always carried the day. Jake Tapper, feeling the heat, tried to move things along. Let's switch gears to the Green New Deal. Congresswoman, this is your flagship policy. Can you explain what this plan really looks like? AOC was relieved to change the subject. This was her home turf, her own creation. The Green New Deal is a massive plan to fix the climate crisis while generating millions of high-paying union jobs. We'd move to 100% clean energy within a decade. We'd renovate every building in the country for energy efficiency. We'd build high-speed rail to reduce our dependence on flying. We'd guarantee a good job for anyone looking for one. It offers a safety net for communities that have always relied on fossil fuels. It's the only plan that actually meets the scale of the emergency we're in. Vance waited for her to finish before asking, "What's the price tag?" Estimates vary depending on... Just give me your rough estimate. Are we talking about 1 trillion, 10 trillion, or maybe 50 trillion? I don't have a precise cost breakdown. The resolution was intended to be a vision, a framework, not a line-item budget. Vance cut in softly. You don't have a cost estimate. You introduced a plan to completely rebuild the American economy, but you didn't check how much it would cost. To start, the resolution was about setting goals, not a finalized budget. But you must have some sense of the sheer scale of the costs involved here. AOC was getting defensive once more. Doing nothing will cost us far more. I agree with you. We need to take action. But I'm asking about your specific strategy. The American Action Forum, and yes, they are a conservative group, so keep that in mind, put the price at $93 trillion over 10 years. Does that number seem totally off base to you? That's just a right-wing organization trying to make the plan look unaffordable. So, what is your number then? Silence. She had nothing. Vance went back to his notes. Let me break down some simple math for you. Your resolution calls for retrofitting every single building in the U.S. to meet energy standards. That's roughly 140 million structures, including homes, apartments, offices, and shops. A deep energy retrofit averages about $30,000 per building. That alone is $4.2 trillion. He turned the page. Your plan also demands 100% clean and renewable energy. Right now, fossil fuels provide about 60% of our power. Switching all of that over to solar, wind, and batteries would cost about $6 trillion based on DOE data. So we're already at $10.2 trillion for just those 2 points. Another page. Your plan calls for expanding high-speed rail to such an extent that air travel becomes completely unnecessary. Right now, there are only about 30,000 miles of high-speed tracks in the entire world. China, the world leader in this area, spent nearly $2 trillion just to build 25,000 miles of it. To build enough rail in America to actually replace most flights, you'd need at least $3 trillion. That brings our total to $13.2 trillion. Vance looked up at her. And we haven't even touched on the jobs guarantee, the universal health care included in the bill, the housing guarantee, or any of the other mandates. So, that $93 trillion figure doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore, does it? AOC started to stammer. Now those are just inflated numbers based on your own resolution. You were the one who proposed these things. I'm simply multiplying the scale by the cost estimates provided by government agencies. What exactly am I getting wrong? She had no answer because he wasn't getting anything wrong. She had simply never bothered to check the math herself. Vance kept going. His voice remained perfectly calm. He sounded like a teacher patiently walking a student through a difficult concept. Spending $93 trillion over 10 years comes out to $9.3 trillion every single year. The entire gross domestic product of the United States is only about $25 trillion per year. You're proposing to spend 37% of the nation's total economic output annually on this one single program. He let that massive number hang in the air for a moment. To put that in perspective, the entire federal government currently spends about 24% of our GDP. You'd be stacking another 37% right on top of that. We would end up with 61% of the entire economy flowing through the federal government. That would make the U.S. government the largest in world history as a percentage of the economy. He turned his gaze toward the audience. How many of you actually want the government controlling 61% of our economy? Not a single hand went up, not even among the Democrats in the room. Vance turned back to AOC. See, this is the problem with aspirational frameworks that ignore the basic math. They sound wonderful until the moment you actually have to make them work. That's when you realize they would require tax rates that nobody would ever accept. You're relying on technology that doesn't exist yet, and a timeline that is physically impossible. AOC was visibly getting frustrated. You're just repeating Republican talking points. I'm just using a calculator. That isn't a Republican or Democratic issue. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of your political leanings. Jake Tapper tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Vance had already established a clear pattern. Every time AOC made a sweeping claim about what she would do, he asked her exactly how. Every time she cited a policy, he brought up the costs and the trade-offs. Every time she tried to pivot to emotion, he gently but firmly pulled the focus back to the facts. and she was clearly struggling to keep up. 21 minutes into the debate, a young woman in the audience stood up to ask a question. She gripped the microphone, looking a bit nervous, but very determined. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I'm a Democrat, and I voted for you, but I have a question about your track record. You helped stop Amazon from building their second headquarters in Queens. That project was supposed to bring in 25,000 jobs. Why exactly did you do that?" AOC's face immediately lit up. This was a topic she was actually proud of. "I took a stand against corporate welfare. Amazon, one of the wealthiest companies on Earth, wanted $3 billion in subsidies from the taxpayers of New York. I said no, because we don't need to bribe corporations to move into our communities. We need them to pay their fair share and create good jobs without demanding handouts." There was a round of applause from some in the audience. Others, however, looked skeptical. Vance raised his hand. "May I follow up on that point?" Tapper gave him a nod. "Congresswoman, exactly how many jobs was Amazon planning to create?" "They promised 25,000, she replied. "They actually guaranteed 25,000 jobs. That wasn't just a vague promise. That was a binding contractual commitment. Those jobs had an average salary of $150,000 per year. So that's $3.75 billion in annual wages that would have flowed into your district and the surrounding area. You killed that deal to save $300 million a year in tax incentives. That is a 12-to-1 return on investment. Most businesses would jump at a 12-to-1 ROI. He paused to let that logic sink in. "So, let me make sure I've got your decision straight. You walked away from $3.75 billion in yearly wages just to avoid spending $300 million in subsidies. That's like refusing to spend $1 to get $12 back. Does that honestly make any sense to you?" AOC scrambled to defend herself. "Those jobs weren't meant for my constituents. They were for tech workers who would have just driven up rents and displaced people. So, are you saying your constituents don't want jobs that pay $150,000 a year? They would have needed specific training and education to even qualify. But Amazon committed to providing that exact training. It was a core part of the agreement. They were going to fund programs to train local residents, create career paths for those without four-year degrees, and offer apprenticeships. Every bit of that was written into the deal." Vance pulled out yet another document from his seemingly endless stack. "And since you killed the Amazon deal, how many comparable jobs have actually come to Queens?" AOC hesitated. "We've been partnering with various other firms. Exactly how many? Give me a concrete figure." "I don't have the specific numbers on me right now." "Well, I do. It's roughly 2,000. You walked away from 25,000 high-paying positions that came with training programs. In return, your district only saw about 2,000 jobs. That means 23,000 opportunities lost for the people of Queens just so you could take a political swipe at Amazon." He turned his gaze toward the crowd. "That isn't standing up for the working class. That's just sacrificing their livelihoods for your ideology." The room fell completely silent. Even some of the Democrats looked uneasy because the numbers were impossible to ignore. AOC attempted to pivot the conversation. "I believe we should focus on who is actually out there fighting for everyday workers. I was raised in a working-class household. I spent time working as a bartender. I understand firsthand what it means to struggle." That was the moment Vance's look shifted. For the first time all night, a look of genuine anger crossed his face. It wasn't a loud outburst, but a cold, controlled, and piercing intensity. "Congresswoman, let's actually talk about what it means to struggle as a worker. You were raised in Yorktown Heights, New York. It's a gorgeous suburb. The median family income there is $140,000. You attended Boston University, where the tuition is $70,000 a year. You worked at a bar for what, maybe 2 years after graduating before getting a seat in Congress at 29. His tone grew even sharper. That isn't what a working-class life looks like. That's the life of an upper-middle-class kid who played at a blue-collar job for a moment to build a political image. The entire audience held their breath. This had turned deeply personal. Vance kept pushing, his intensity mounting. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mom struggled with drug addiction. My dad walked out on us. I was raised by my grandparents in a home where we never knew if the lights or water would stay on. We were poor, truly poor, not just spent a couple of years bartending poor, like the wondering if we'd eat today kind of poor. I joined the Marine Corps because I had zero other choices. I relied on the GI Bill to get through college. I worked my way through Yale Law School while going full-time. Every single job I've ever had was a matter of survival. It wasn't about gaining experience or telling a story for my brand. It was for food, rent, and staying alive. He stared her down directly. So when you start lecturing about the working-class struggle, remember that I actually lived it. You just cosplayed it for your Instagram followers. A heavy, absolute silence filled the room. No one in the crowd moved a muscle. Nobody even seemed to breathe. But Vance wasn't finished yet. And this is what really gets to me about your brand of politics. The very policies you're pushing would destroy the real working class. Not the version you see on Twitter or in viral clips. The actual people who work with their hands, stress over bills, and don't have the luxury of worrying about aspirational frameworks. Your Green New Deal would essentially outlaw fossil fuels. Do you have any idea who works in oil and gas? The pipe fitters, welders, electricians, and truck drivers from places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, who don't have trust funds or fancy degrees. They depend on those jobs to survive. But your plan just wipes them out without offering any real way to replace them. Your Medicare for All plan would completely scrap private insurance. Do you know who actually works in that industry? There are 500,000 people, claims processors, support reps, and coordinators, all holding down working-class jobs. Where are they supposed to go once you destroy their entire field? A 15-year-old man, the bite minimum wage might sound like it's coming from a place of compassion. But do you know what the reality is? Small businesses simply cannot afford those costs. So they start laying people off. It makes it impossible for young people to find entry-level work. Then you see teen unemployment go through the roof. I've actually looked at the data. The results are undeniable. His voice started to rise just a bit. You push these massive policies that get cheers at rallies, but they end up hurting the very people you claim to protect because you've never had to deal with the fallout of your own ideas. You went straight from a comfortable suburb to an elite university and then right into Congress. You've never felt the pain of what happens when a bad policy rips a community apart. He took a moment to pause. He let the weight of the moment sink in. I have felt it. My family certainly has. My entire hometown has. We've lived through the factory closures, the loss of jobs, and an opioid epidemic that took the lives of the people I grew up with. We understand exactly what happens when a policy sounds great on paper but fails in the real world. He looked first at her, then turned to the audience. You know what it's like to rack up likes on Twitter, to go viral, and to be celebrated by the Hollywood elite and activists. That is your entire version of the working-class struggle. My version was watching my own mother overdose, wondering where my next meal was coming from, and joining the military as my only ticket out. So, don't you dare lecture me on working-class values and stop pretending your policies help these people when the numbers prove they're destroying their jobs and their towns. The audience sat in stunned silence, too shaken to even clap. AOC looked as though she'd just been hit. She stood there, hands white-knuckled on the podium, her face turned a deep shade of red. She tried to find a comeback, but the words wouldn't come because every point he made hit home. And everyone in that auditorium felt the truth of it. Jake Tapper, visibly rattled by how intense the moment had become, scrambled to regain control of the debate. Let's just take a second to breathe and move on to our next topic. We've got time for one more deep dive before we wrap up with closing statements. Vance gave a nod. His intensity had subsided. He was back to his calm, methodical persona. I'd like to pivot back to the Green New Deal, if that's okay with you, Jake. I want to ask the Congresswoman to break down one specific part of it. Tapper turned his gaze toward AOC. She gave a nod, but her expression remained cautious. Congresswoman, your Green New Deal proposal features a federal jobs guarantee. Could you explain exactly what that entails? AOC felt relieved to move away from the personal attacks and back to policy. A jobs guarantee basically means the government ensures anyone who wants to work will have a position. It's about providing meaningful labor with real dignity and a living wage. What sort of jobs are we talking about? Any work that serves the community, like infrastructure, health care, education, environmental cleanup, or public service. And who exactly determines what needs doing? Federal agencies would team up with local communities to spot those needs. So, essentially, the government handles the decision-making and the management of these workers. Where would they actually be stationed? And what would their paychecks look like? AOC's frustration was starting to show. Those are just details we'd work out during implementation. Vance cut her off with a gentle but firm tone. No, those aren't just minor details. That is the policy in its entirety. You can't just promise jobs for everyone without explaining the mechanics behind it. That's not a strategy. That's just a catchphrase. He decided to change his angle. Let me try some simpler questions. How many Americans are out of work right now? It was obvious AOC didn't have the number. I'd have to double-check the latest figures from the Labor Department. It's roughly 6 million. So, a jobs guarantee would have to hire at least 6 million people right off the bat. Exactly. Otherwise, you aren't truly guaranteeing employment for everyone in a full rollout. Correct. And what's the typical salary for a federal employee? It varies by role, but on average, roughly, maybe around $50,000. Got it. So 6 million workers at $50,000 each. That adds up to $300 billion a year just for the payroll. Then you have to add benefits, which usually tack on another 30% for government staff. Factor in management, facilities, gear, and training. We're looking at least $400 billion annually. Vance locked eyes with her. Where is that $400 billion coming from? Which taxes are going up? AOC sat there in silence. Like I said, it's an investment in our people. That doesn't actually answer what I asked. Where does the $400 billion come from? This is your proposal. You have to know how you're going to fund it. More silence. Vance kept pushing, his voice steady but completely relentless. And here's something else. Who's actually going to take these guaranteed jobs? Would it be a requirement? If someone is out of work but turns down a guaranteed job, do they lose their unemployment? Or can they just stay home and keep collecting checks? AOC began to stumble over her words. There would be incentives to join, so yes, people could decline the work. Then it isn't much of a guarantee, is it? It's just a massive, costly jobs program that people can simply ignore. The goal is to make the jobs so appealing but who gets to decide what's appealing? What if the offered job is miles away from where someone lives? What if it has nothing to do with their professional background? What if they simply don't want a government boss? Must they accept it or forfeit their benefits? Each question revealed yet another hole in the plan, another detail she simply hadn't considered. Vance wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just being meticulous, asking the exact things any real lawmaker should answer before launching a policy. And AOC was coming up empty because she'd never actually done the legwork. She just liked the way jobs guarantee sounded in a speech. Vance took a step back and scanned the crowd. This is how it always goes, folks. The Congresswoman calls for these massive overhauls of American life. But when you ask how they work, she's got nothing. When you ask about the price tag, she's clueless. When you ask who's paying, she doesn't have an answer. Yet, she's 100%. We have to do it. He turned back toward AOC. Congresswoman, you've spent 6 years in office. You have a seat on the Financial Services Committee. You've put your name on major bills. You've delivered endless speeches about changing this country. But you can't answer the most basic questions about your own ideas. You don't know the cost. You don't know where the funding is. You don't know how to roll them out. You don't know who would run them. You don't know what the trade-offs are. You just know they sound nice. They feel virtuous. They get you a lot of likes on social media. His tone was low, but the impact was devastating. That isn't leading. That's just performance art. And the American people deserve better. Watching the last 20 minutes of that town hall was genuinely hard. Jake Tapper tried to throw AOC a few lifelines so she could recover. He asked her about different topics. He tossed her some easy questions about her future vision, but the damage was already done. Every word she said now felt empty. Every bit of her passion felt staged after what everyone had just witnessed. The crowd's questions were merciless, even those coming from Democrats. A young man rose to his feet. Congresswoman, I consider myself a progressive voter. But after listening to this conversation, I honestly don't see how any of your plans would actually function. Can you name a single bill you've sponsored that includes specific funding details and a clear rollout strategy, something you haven't been able to provide? A woman in her 30s spoke up. You keep talking about taxing the wealthy, but Vice President Vance just proved that wouldn't cover the costs. Where is the rest of that money coming from? Are you actually suggesting tax hikes for the middle class? AOC tried to sidestep the issue. Vance calmly steered the conversation back. That's actually a fantastic question. Are you pushing for tax increases on the middle class? Is it a yes or a no? She refused to give a straight answer, which was a clear answer in itself. A college student stood up. I used to back the Green New Deal, but I had no idea it would cost that much. How could you introduce it without knowing the price tag? AOC simply didn't have a solid response. By the time they reached the closing statements, she looked completely deflated. The self-assured social media star from the start of the night had vanished. Her final remarks felt purely defensive. She spoke about how DC insiders use arithmetic to crush ambitious ideas. She talked about how we can't be afraid to dream big. She argued that the moral weight of the crisis we face requires immediate action, not over-analysis. It fell completely flat. The entire audience had just watched her struggle to justify her own platform. Vance's final statement was straightforward. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for joining us tonight. I realize this wasn't an easy task. These discussions are tough, but they're vital because governing isn't about catchy slogans, viral clips, or just making people feel better. It's about fixing issues, actual problems facing actual citizens. That takes a lot more than just passion. It demands competence, real knowledge, and the capacity to grasp how policy functions, calculating the math, weighing the long-term consequences, making hard trade-offs, and being transparent about the price tags. He stared straight into the lens. Americans deserve leaders who have done the work, who know the cost of their own plans, who can explain the implementation, and who realize that good intentions simply aren't enough. Tonight, I asked the Congresswoman to break down her own policies. She was unable to do so, and that should be a major concern for anyone who values effective leadership. It was simple, blunt, and absolutely devastating. Within a few hours, the internet was on fire. The footage spread like wildfire. It hit X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram all at the same time. You don't know your own tax rate racked up 67 million views in just 2 hours. You cosplayed working-class struggle hit 89 million views. The full breakdown of Green New Deal math, 134 million views. That's performance art, not governance. 78 million views. The sequence where AOC failed to explain the jobs guarantee, 56 million views. Conservative outlets shifted into high gear. Vance dismantles AOC with pure facts and logic. The bartender gets an economics lesson from a scholar. When socialism goes up against math, math always wins. They ran the clips on a non-stop loop. They brought in economic experts to verify Vance's figures and marveled at how completely AOC had been unmasked. However, the most fascinating response actually came from the left. Liberal media tried to put a spin on the night. Vance's aggressive debating style raises some serious questions. AOC held to an unfair standard regarding policy specifics. Why Republicans are weaponizing arithmetic against progressive agendas. But even they couldn't really stand by her performance. The points Vance raised weren't out of bounds. They were fundamental. What's the actual price tag? How are you going to pay for it? How exactly would it function? Those aren't gotcha traps. Those are exactly the things any lawmaker should be able to explain about their own bills. And she simply had no answers. The comments on liberal websites were absolutely savage. I've stood up for AOC for years, but man, she got wrecked. She honestly couldn't even explain her own legislation. How can you suggest spending trillions of dollars without knowing where the cash is coming from? I'm a progressive, but this was just painful to watch. Vance asked fair questions, and she was totally stumped. She's a pro on Twitter, but maybe that doesn't translate to being good at policy. Even some fellow progressive politicians started quietly pulling away. Nobody wanted to be associated with a performance that disastrous. The hashtags told the whole story. That Explain Your Bill was trending #1 across the globe. AOC Exposed sat at #2. Math Matters was #4. Vance Wins held the #7 spot. By the following morning, every major news outlet was covering the story. AOC struggles to defend her platform in a debate with Vance. Questions grow regarding Ocasio-Cortez's ability to legislate. When passion hits policy, AOC's rough night. Alexandria. Ocasio-Cortez walked into that town hall thinking she'd school America on the future of progressivism, but she ended up as a cautionary tale about the gap between social media fame and actual governing skill. The fallout was almost instant. Within just a week, polls showed AOC's favorability had plummeted by 15 points. Even back in her own district, her base was starting to waver. People began asking the kind of questions they'd never considered before. Does she really know what she's doing? Or is this all just a big performance? By the second week, something truly notable took place. Fellow members of Congress who had co-sponsored her bills began quietly backing away. There were no loud announcements or press releases. They simply let their names slip off the legislation. After that debate, no one wanted their name attached to bills that couldn't be explained or defended. The Green New Deal resolution, which once boasted over 100 co-sponsors, shriveled to just 23 within a month. Medicare for All, her signature cause, suddenly lacked anyone willing to defend the specific version she had put forward. Her landmark legislation was vanishing, not because of Republican attacks, but because Democrats were sprinting away from it. By the month's end, a primary challenger emerged, a moderate Democrat and former city councilwoman who actually lived in the district and knew its streets. Her announcement video didn't pull any punches. "I've lived in Queens my entire life. I've raised my family here, built a business here, and served on the city council for 8 years. I know this district. I know what we need. We need serious representation, not a social media star. Someone who can actually explain their policies and provide real leadership for real people." The video went viral, but in a completely different way than AOC's typical posts. This felt like the real deal. AOC tried to strike back, giving interviews where she claimed she'd been ambushed, that Vance played dirty, and that expecting her to memorize every single number was an impossible bar to clear. But those excuses only backfired because Vance never asked for memorized statistics. He had simply asked her to explain the basic mechanics and costs of her own proposals in general terms, and she just couldn't do it. By month 3, major Democratic donors began pulling their funding, not because they stopped believing in her values, but because they realized she lacked the ability to turn those values into working policy. The Squad, her circle of progressive allies in Congress, stopped standing up for her so fiercely. They were terrified of being dragged down by the association. National progressive groups that had once put her on a pedestal started covering their tracks. It turns out that putting all their chips on AOC might not have been the smartest move. 6 months after the debate, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called a press conference in her district. She looked exhausted. That famous energy she usually radiated had all but vanished. "After a lot of thought and talking it over with my family, I've decided not to run for re-election to Congress. I'm proud of the work we did to change the conversation in Washington, bring bold ideas into the mainstream, and inspire young people to believe in change. But I believe I can be more effective continuing that work outside of office, organizing, building movements, and taking direct action in our communities." It was the typical politician's exit speech wrapped in positivity, but everyone saw through it. She simply couldn't win. Not after being exposed so completely. Not after proving she couldn't even defend her own policies. It was better to bow out with some dignity than to get crushed in a primary by 30 points. Taking her seat in Congress was the moderate Democrat who had challenged her. A woman with genuine policy expertise who could explain her plans and had clearly done the homework. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance returned to his duties as vice president. His role as the educator in that town hall debate became a textbook case study for political science classes for years to come. It wasn't because he was mean or used cheap tricks. It was simply because he asked someone to explain their own policies, and they failed. A year later, a Yale political science professor invited Vance to speak to her students. The lecture was on policy development and political communication. Naturally, The subtopic turned to the AOC debate. A student raised her hand during the Q&A session. Mr. Vice President, do you feel bad about what happened to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's career after that debate? Vance paused to think for a second. No, I don't. She spent 6 years pushing legislation she hadn't thought through, proposing trillion-dollar policies without a funding plan, and giving inspiring speeches that could never actually be implemented. I just asked her the basic questions. What's the price tag? How do you fund it? How does it actually function? Those aren't gotcha questions. Those are the absolute basics any lawmaker should be able to handle. He took a beat. If asking someone to explain their own bill ruins their career, the problem isn't the questions. The real problem is they never should have been pitching laws they didn't grasp in the first place. Another student spoke up. But don't you think expecting detailed knowledge of funding mechanisms and implementation plans is setting the bar too high? Most politicians don't have all those specifics down. Vance gave a quick headshake. Most lawmakers at least get the big picture. They can explain in general terms how the money would be funded and how they'd operate. They've done enough homework to stand behind their proposals. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez just couldn't do that. Not because my questions were rigged, but because she'd never bothered to actually learn. She'd built a brand on passion and viral clips without ever doing the heavy lifting. And that isn't governing. It's just a performance. And America deserves better than a show. A third student asked, what should people take away from what happened? Vance weighed the question carefully, noting that passion isn't enough, that good intentions aren't enough, and that moral certainty simply isn't enough. Leading requires competence, knowledge, the ability to actually grasp how policy functions and to think through the consequences. AOC mistook Twitter popularity for actual policy expertise. She assumed because millions of people liked her posts, her ideas must be solid. But the two things aren't even related. Social media values the performance. Real governance requires substance. And if you can't bring substance, someone is eventually going to ask you to explain yourself. He scanned the room. I truly hope the next generation of leaders learns from this. Do your due diligence. Understand your own proposals. Make sure you can explain how they'd work. Know exactly what the price tag is. Think through the trade-offs. Because if you can't stand by your policies when someone asks basic questions, you aren't ready to be a lawmaker. You're just playing a part for the cameras. The AOC Town Hall became a case study for all sorts of classes. Political science courses taught it as an example of how celebrity status is worlds apart from actual governing. How social media fame can fake the illusion of policy expertise. How voters sometimes mistake passion for real competence. Economics departments used it to teach policy analysis, demonstrating how to check if ambitious proposals are mathematically feasible and how to identify the gap between the talk and the reality. Law schools even added it to their drafting courses as a cautionary tale about writing bills without knowing how they work under the hood. Business schools picked it up for their negotiation and communication classes. Vance's strategy of asking simple questions and letting the other side trip themselves up became a standard teaching tool. The footage ended up being watched hundreds of millions of times total. People picked it apart from every possible angle. The moment Vance asked where that $8 to $12 trillion was coming from. That long silence when AOC had no answer. The comparison to the working class, the whole jobs guarantee exchange, and AOC herself pretty much vanished from national stage. She did a bit of organizing work and stayed active on social media, even as her numbers gradually slipped away, occasionally giving speeches at progressive rallies. But she was no longer seen as a serious policy voice because everyone saw what happened when she was pressed to explain her own ideas. She just couldn't. And once that weakness was out in the open, there was no taking it back. Her Wikipedia bio got a total makeover. It used to start by calling her a progressive icon and the youngest woman ever in Congress. Now, the first paragraph mentions her fading influence after she failed to defend her policies in a televised debate. There's an entire section now on her lack of legislative skill. The Met Gala dress is still mentioned. The bartender backstory. The squad. But the whole narrative had shifted. She was no longer seen as the future of the Democratic Party. She was a warning about the massive gap between being a celebrity and being competent. And J.D. Vance, the kid from Appalachia who climbed out of poverty through the Marines and Yale, who wrote the book on the forgotten working class, and who actually lived the life AOC had just been cosplaying, became known as more than just the vice president. He was the man who pulled back the curtain on progressive rhetoric, not through attacks or tricks or manipulation, but simply by asking someone to explain their own work and showing the world that they couldn't. Sometimes the most crushing question is also the simplest one. How does it actually work? And if you can't answer that, maybe you shouldn't be pitching it.